Sophia stood at the edge of the bustling train station, her fingers tightening around the strap of her worn leather bag. The announcement of delayed trains buzzed through the air, blending with the murmur of impatient travelers. But Sophia wasn't like the others. She wasn't here for a routine journey. She was chasing answers. In her bag lay an old, faded letter, one she'd found tucked away in her late grandfather's belongings. Its cryptic words hinted at a secret buried deep in her family's past, something too important to ignore. As the cold wind swept through the station, Sophia glanced at her phone, the screen lighting up with missed calls from her best friend Liam. He'd warned her not to dig too deep, claiming some truths were better left hidden. But Sophia's curiosity was unstoppable. What could her grandfather have meant by, "The key is where it all began"? Her thoughts were interrupted by a man in a dark coat who passed too close, his eyes lingering on her bag for just a moment too long. She turned instinctively, her heart pounding. Was it paranoia, or was someone following her? She brushed off the thought, determined not to let fear cloud her mission. As the train pulled in with a deafening screech, Sophia took a deep breath and stepped aboard, the letter now pressed tightly against her chest. She had no idea what awaited her at the other end of the journey, but one thing was clear: this wasn't going to be an ordinary trip. And just as the train doors slid shut, she spotted the man in the dark coat stepping into her car, his gaze locking onto hers. The adventure she thought she was prepared for had only just begun. Sophia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her eyes flicking to the man in the dark coat. He had taken a spot a few rows back, but she could feel his gaze like a weight on her shoulders. Her fingers brushed over the folded letter in her bag, the texture of the aged paper grounding her in the moment. She couldn't let her nerves get the better of her. This journey was about more than her unease. It was about uncovering the truth her grandfather had kept hidden for so long. The rhythmic hum of the train began to steady her racing thoughts. Memories of her grandfather flooded back. His warm laughter, the way he always had a story to tell, and the quiet moments when he'd retreat to his study, locking the door behind him. He'd always been a man of mystery, but she never imagined he carried secrets this big. The letter spoke of a lost heirloom and a place called Bellwood Estate. It was an old family property she'd only heard whispers about, a place tied to an inheritance long forgotten. Sophia pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to Liam. "I think someone's following me. I'll call you when I get there." She hesitated before pressing send, wondering if she was overreacting. The man hadn't done anything yet, but there was something unsettling about his presence. The train lurched, and she glanced out the window at the darkening landscape. Bellwood wasn't far now. Her heart raced at the thought of what she might find there. Her grandfather had described the estate as a vault of truths, but what did that mean? Was it a place, an object, or something more intangible? She didn't have answers yet, only questions that seemed to multiply with every passing mile. Sophia felt a shift in the air as the man stood and began walking slowly toward her. She tightened her grip on the letter and tried to keep her expression calm, though her pulse quickened. Was he about to confront her, or was she imagining his intent? Before she could decide, the train lights flickered, plunging the car into momentary darkness. When they blinked back on, the man was gone. Sophia looked around frantically, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't heard him leave, and yet his seat was empty. The mystery was deepening, and whatever lay ahead at Bellwood Estate, it was clear she was no longer the only one searching for the truth. Sophia's hands trembled as she clutched the letter tighter, her eyes darting across the train car. The man's sudden disappearance made no sense. She hadn't heard him move, let alone leave. Other passengers seemed oblivious, immersed in their books or scrolling on their phones. Was she imagining things, or was this journey unraveling more than just her family's secrets? As the train sped toward Bellwood, Sophia tried to focus on the letter again. She unfolded it carefully, reading the faded words under the dim light. Her grandfather's handwriting was neat but firm, the tone both cryptic and urgent. The phrases, "protect what's left," and "trust no one," stood out like warnings meant to echo through time. She didn't know what she was walking into, but her instincts told her it was more than an old family matter. Her thoughts were interrupted by a faint vibration from her phone. A message from Liam appeared. "Be careful. If something feels off, get out of there." She smiled faintly at his concern, but deep down she knew there was no turning back. She typed a quick response, assuring him she'd be fine, even though she wasn't sure she believed it. The train slowed as the announcement for Bellwood Station crackled through the speakers. Sophia gathered her bag and stood, her heart thudding as she approached the exit. The station was small and eerily quiet, the platform bathed in dim light from flickering bulbs. She stepped off the train and paused, scanning the empty surroundings. The man in the dark coat was nowhere in sight, but the feeling of being watched hadn't left her. As Sophia exited the station, she spotted a narrow path leading into the woods. According to her research, the estate was hidden just beyond the trees. The air grew colder with every step she took, the sounds of the train station fading behind her. Twigs cracked under her boots, and shadows seemed to move in the periphery of her vision. She couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was nearby. When the mansion finally came into view, Sophia stopped in her tracks. Bellwood was nothing like she imagined. The once grand estate was now cloaked in decay, its windows shattered and ivy consuming the walls. Yet, there was a strange beauty to it, as though it held onto its secrets with quiet defiance. She approached cautiously, her breath visible in the cold air. Pushing open the heavy gate, she froze. A light flickered inside the house. Someone was already there. Her mind raced. Could it be the man from the train? Or was it someone else entirely? As she took a hesitant step forward, a loud crash echoed from inside the mansion, followed by a voice, low, urgent, and unmistakably human. Sophia's heart pounded. She wasn't alone. Whatever was hidden within Bellwood, it was about to come to light, whether she was ready or not. Sophia's breath hitched as she crept toward the entrance of Bellwood Estate. The crash still echoed in her mind, and the low murmur of a voice sent shivers down her spine. She hesitated at the threshold, her fingers brushing against the cold wood of the door. The flickering light inside cast shifting shadows, creating shapes that seemed almost alive. Every instinct screamed for her to turn back, but the letter's words replayed in her mind. Protect what's left. There was no turning back now. She stepped inside, the floorboards groaning beneath her weight. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Sophia's eyes adjusted to the dim light as she scanned the grand, decaying foyer. A chandelier hung precariously overhead, its crystals catching the faint glow of a single candle on a distant table. The source of the crash wasn't immediately visible, but the voice had gone silent, leaving the mansion in an eerie stillness. Moving deeper into the house, Sophia's mind raced. Who else could be here? Was it the man from the train, or someone connected to the mystery surrounding her grandfather's letter? Her heart pounded as she turned a corner and spotted muddy footprints leading down a long hallway. She followed them cautiously, the sound of her own breathing loud in her ears. The footprints stopped abruptly outside a heavy door. Sophia hesitated, her hand hovering over the tarnished brass handle. Before she could decide what to do, the door creaked open slightly, as though inviting her in. She swallowed hard and pushed it further, revealing a dimly lit study. Papers were scattered across a massive desk, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. A figure stood near the fireplace, their back to her. "Who's there?" Sophia's voice wavered, but she forced herself to stand her ground. The figure didn't turn immediately, their movements slow and deliberate as they reached for something on the desk. Sophia's pulse quickened. When they finally turned, her eyes widened in shock. It wasn't the man from the train. It was someone entirely unexpected, someone she thought she'd never see again. Before she could speak, they raised a finger to their lips, signaling for silence. "You shouldn't have come here, Sophia," the figure said, their voice calm but edged with urgency. "This place, it's dangerous. And now they know you're here." Sophia barely had time to process the words before the sound of heavy footsteps echoed from the hallway. Whoever was approaching wasn't trying to hide. Panic surged through her as the figure stepped closer and whispered, "Hide. Now." Sophia darted behind an old bookshelf just as the door burst open. Shadows spilled into the room, followed by two men she didn't recognize. Their voices were low, their words clipped as they searched the study. She held her breath, her heart thundering in her chest. The men's conversation hinted at something much larger than her grandfather's secrets, something that tied Bellwood to a web of deceit and danger far beyond anything she'd imagined. Sophia pressed herself tightly against the bookshelf, her breath shallow as she listened to the men rummaging through the study. Their movements were deliberate, each thud and shuffle sending a spike of fear through her. The figure who had warned her to hide remained calm, standing near the desk as though they belonged there. Sophia strained to hear the conversation, catching fragmented sentences that hinted at something much bigger than a family secret. "We can't leave without it," one of the men growled. His voice was low but firm, filled with urgency. "They're already closing in, and if we don't deliver, you know what happens." The other man muttered something under his breath, his tone sharper. "I told you this would get messy. She shouldn't have sent us here without backup. What if the old man's granddaughter has the key?" Sophia's heart froze. They were talking about her. The letter, her presence. It wasn't a coincidence. Her grandfather's cryptic instructions weren't just a trail to uncover a forgotten heirloom. They were tied to something far more dangerous. The weight of her bag felt heavier as she thought about the letter inside. Was that what they were after? The figure by the desk cleared their throat, drawing the men's attention. "You're wasting time," they said firmly, their voice steady. "The key isn't here. If you want answers, you'll have to look somewhere else." The tension in the room thickened. One of the men stepped forward, his boots echoing ominously on the wooden floor. "And how would you know that?" he challenged, his voice laced with suspicion. "Unless you've been keeping things from her, too." The figure didn't flinch. "I know because I've been watching longer than you have. Trust me, what you're looking for isn't here." Sophia's mind raced. Who was this person? An ally? An enemy? She couldn't decide. The men exchanged a look, their frustration clear, but they didn't press further. Instead, one of them growled, "If you're lying, it's your head. We'll check upstairs. Keep her out of our way." Sophia stayed frozen as the men stormed out, their heavy footsteps fading into the distance. Her pulse pounded as she peered around the edge of the bookshelf. The figure by the desk turned and locked eyes with her, their expression unreadable. "You need to leave. Now," they whispered urgently. "You don't understand what's happening, and if they find you here, it's over." Sophia stepped out cautiously, her voice barely above a whisper. "Who are you? And what do you mean, it's over? What's going on here?" The figure hesitated, their eyes flicking toward the door. "There's no time to explain everything. Just know this. Your grandfather wasn't who you think he was. Bellwood is more than an estate, and that letter in your bag? It's not just a keepsake. It's the only thing keeping you alive right now." Before Sophia could process the revelation, A distant sound shattered the moment, glass breaking somewhere upstairs. The figure's face darkened. "They're not giving up. We need to move." As they pulled her toward a hidden passage behind the bookshelf, Sophia's thoughts swirled in chaos. The stakes had just skyrocketed, and the truth, whatever it was, felt closer than ever. But so did the danger. Sophia stumbled into the narrow passage behind the bookshelf, her heart racing as the figure closed the hidden door behind them. The air was damp and cold, the faint scent of earth filling her nose. A flickering flashlight illuminated the cramped space as they led her through twisting corridors that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the estate. "They'll search every inch of this house," the figure said, their tone urgent but calm. "We have to reach the vault before they do." "The vault?" Sophia asked, struggling to keep up. "What is it? What's inside?" The figure glanced back at her, their face grim. "The truth your grandfather died protecting. And if we don't get there first, you'll never leave Bellwood alive." Sophia's mind spun as they emerged into a cavernous room deep beneath the estate. At its center stood an imposing iron door, intricate carvings etched into its surface. The figure gestured to the letter in her bag. "The key isn't metal, it's words. Your grandfather's letter holds the code to unlock this." Sophia's hands shook as she unfolded the letter, scanning the faded words for anything that could be a clue. Her grandfather's handwriting, once comforting, now seemed to mock her as the urgency of the moment pressed down on her. Then she saw it, a series of numbers and phrases woven into the text, hidden in plain sight. She recited the sequence aloud, her voice echoing in the chamber. The carvings on the door glowed faintly before the iron groaned and creaked open. A rush of cold air spilled out, revealing a small room lined with shelves. At its center stood a single pedestal holding an unassuming wooden box. The figure stepped forward, but stopped abruptly. "It's your choice," they said, their voice soft. "Whatever's in there, once it's revealed, can't be undone." Sophia hesitated before approaching the box. Her fingers traced its surface before she lifted the lid. Inside was a collection of documents, photographs, and a small, intricately designed key. But what caught her attention was a letter addressed to her in her grandfather's handwriting. As she read, her blood ran cold. The letter revealed a decades-old conspiracy involving powerful figures who had used Bellwood as a front for illegal operations. Her grandfather had spent his life trying to dismantle it from the inside, leaving behind the evidence she now held. The men searching the house weren't just after her. They were part of the very network her grandfather had fought to expose. Before she could speak, the sound of footsteps echoed from the passageway. The men had found them. The figure pulled Sophia behind the pedestal and whispered, "Trust me." The men burst into the room, their eyes locking onto the open vault. Too late, one snarled. "Hand it over." Sophia stepped forward, surprising even herself. "You'll never get away with this," she said, holding the documents close. "Everything you've done is here. It's over." One of the men laughed, but before he could respond, the figure lunged, triggering a mechanism that sent the vault's heavy door slamming shut. The chamber rumbled, sealing Sophia and the figure inside while trapping the men outside. As silence settled, Sophia turned to the figure. "Why did you help me?" They removed their hood, revealing a face eerily familiar. "Because your grandfather wasn't just fighting for justice, he was fighting for family. And so am I." Sophia stared in shock as the figure smiled faintly. "I'm your uncle," they said, "and we've just started what your grandfather couldn't finish." Sophia sat in the dimly lit vault, her mind racing with everything she had just learned. The revelation that the figure standing before her was her uncle, a man her grandfather had trusted to carry on his work, left her shaken but oddly comforted. For the first time, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Her family's legacy wasn't just one of mystery, but of courage and sacrifice. The fight her grandfather had started was far from over, but now she knew she wasn't alone. The sound of pounding on the sealed door echoed through the chamber. The men on the other side were desperate, shouting threats that grew more frantic by the second. Her uncle calmly reached for a hidden lever embedded in the wall. With a sharp pull, the chamber's mechanisms roared to life, and the entire room began to shift. The vault, it seemed, had been designed with more than just storage in mind. A concealed passage opened behind them, and her uncle motioned for her to follow. "This will take us to safety," he said, his tone steady. "But we have to move quickly." Sophia clutched the documents and key tightly as they hurried through the narrow corridor. She could hear the men's muffled voices growing distant, their pounding drowned out by the sound of grinding stone as the passage sealed itself behind them. When they finally emerged into the cool night air, Sophia took a deep breath, the tension in her chest easing slightly. The estate loomed behind them, its shadow stretching across the overgrown grounds. Her uncle placed a hand on her shoulder, his expression both serious and hopeful. "Your grandfather believed the truth could bring justice," he said quietly. "But it's up to us to make sure it reaches the right hands." Sophia nodded, the weight of the responsibility sinking in. "We'll finish what he started," she replied, her voice firm. Together, they made their way toward the edge of the property, the first hints of dawn breaking on the horizon. In the days that followed, Sophia worked tirelessly with her uncle to ensure the evidence was delivered to authorities and the story exposed. The men who had pursued them were eventually apprehended, their network dismantled piece by piece. Though the fight had come at a cost, Sophia felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her grandfather's legacy wasn't just about uncovering the past. It was about building a future where truth and justice prevailed. As she stood on the steps of Bellwood one last time, the estate now quiet and empty, Sophia allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey had changed her, revealing not only her family's hidden strength but her own. With a final glance at the place that had held so many secrets, she turned and walked away, ready to embrace the new chapter ahead.